Hello again. In this, our third section on the canonization of the New Testament, I want to go into some detail concerning canon lists and the problem of the open canon, or the question as to whether or not the canon has in fact been closed. I think all of us would answer that question, well, yes, of course it has. But with new discoveries, potential exists for a new letter of Paul to be found, a new letter of Peter, a new addition or supplement to the Acts of the Apostles. What if in the deserts of Egypt, scholars discovered a first century copy of a new gospel that was orthodox, that was ancient, that was apostolic? And if it met the criteria that we discussed earlier, what's to hinder us from considering? Or is the canon completely closed and no further discoveries, no matter what, could ever be added to it? That's an important issue for us to consider and for us to ponder. But in the meanwhile, since no such discovery has been made, I want to give you a list of canon lists, list names that describe or contain a listing of canonical materials. The first is the list of Eusebius, church father. The second is the cataloging Codex Claromontanus. The third is a list by Cyril of Jerusalem, another church father. The fourth is the Muratorian fragment. The fifth is Athanasius' list. Athanasius' list is his letter written at Easter, which describes the 27 books of the New Testament as we currently have them. In fact, Athanasius' list is the most famous and is referenced constantly. Number 6, the Mommsen Catalog. Number 7, the Apostolic Canon number 85. Number 9, Gregory of Nazianzus list. Number 10, the African Canons. Number 11, Jerome, in his 53rd epistle, he lists all of the books of the Bible. Augustine does the same thing. He's number 12. Amphilochus has a list of canonical materials. Rufinus is number 14. Pope Innocent, number 15. He lived around the year 400 and published his list around that time in Rome. And finally, number 16, the Syrian Catalog of St. Catherine's, again from around 400. All of these canonical lists, in fact, date from around 303, number 1, Eusebius, to the 4th century, 400 CE, Syrian's catalog number 16 on the list. These 16 lists are very important in the history of the canon because they're the earliest listings by Christians of what those Christians viewed as scripture. But what's so interesting is that this list doesn't exist until the year 303, the earliest, the first example, which means that for a couple of 100 years, 300 years or so, 250 years after the execution and resurrection of Jesus, scripture was open-ended, and various people in various parts of the Roman Empire used various texts as scripture. As I discussed earlier, there were groups that valued the Shepherd of Hermas. There were groups that valued the Didache. There were some that valued all of the books we presently have. There were some that valued the books we presently have, except they excluded the book of Revelation. As I mentioned before, the Protestant Reformation excluded the Deuterocanonicals, which are still held as scripture by Catholics. So that there were a number of issues and a number of problems, and there really isn't any simple explanation as to how it all came together, except to say that it was simply a list of documents viewed as useful and important by the early church, by the bishops of the church, by the Emperor Constantine, who urged Christians to sort of come together because he wanted to use them politically. And of course, a unified group is easier to control. The whole problem with Constantine is another issue altogether. Uh, and there were in many places various Christians arguing for the acceptance of this book or that book, these writings or those writings. And it's not as simple as we often believe today. The early church, under the second generation of Christians who lived around 100 to 150, weren't in the enviable position that we are to go to their shelf and open a book and have scripture clearly defined for them. They struggled with which books were valuable and which books were necessary. So some of these books, interestingly enough, were removed from the canon, as I've said, and I want to give you some examples of these. For instance, if you have a copy of Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century copy of the New Testament, it includes the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas. Codex Alexandrinus, a 5th century manuscript, includes 1st and 2nd Clement in its New Testament. It also includes the Psalms of Solomon. Codex Claromontanus from the 5th century includes the Shepherd of Hermas and a book titled The Acts of Paul and the Apocalypse of Peter, but it omits Philemon, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, and Hebrews from its New Testament collection. For whatever reason, Codex Vaticanus from, again, the 4th century, omits 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Revelation. Though it seems odd to us, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, then, these canonical collections, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, these major collections of biblical documents varied from one another, so that the notion of the canon, the scriptures, the materials that the early church turned to in an effort to understand God and God's doings with the world through Christ and the church and the apostles, this closed canon didn't exist until the 4th century. So it's to that subject that we'll turn next, the closing of the canon. Until then.